Tonight, we're diving into a fascinating journey through the brutal reality of everyday existence in ancient Egypt. Ever wondered what life was really like beyond the glamorous pharaohs and magnificent pyramids? You're about to discover a world where the average person faced a daily gauntlet of horrors that would break most modern humans within hours. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Tonight, I'll take you through the complete Egyptian nightmare from dawn to dusk, from waking up covered in parasites and venomous creatures, through workdays so brutal they shattered spines by age 30, to meals containing enough sand to wear your teeth down to the nerve. We'll explore how 3-foot-long worms grew inside people's bodies before painfully emerging through their skin, why half of all children died before age 5, and how the Nile, source of all Egyptian life, was also a deadly soup of infectious disease and predatory animals. You'll discover what it really took to build the pyramids, as workers hauled 20-ton stone blocks in 120-degree heat with ropes cutting into their shoulders. Many crushed to death when rigging failed. We'll examine mummies to see the crippling arthritis, parasitic infections, and horrific dental abscesses that were simply normal parts of daily existence. By the time we finish, you'll understand why Egyptians were so obsessed with death and the afterlife, because their daily reality was so unbearable that eternal paradise seemed their only hope for escape from suffering. You'll never look at those colorful hieroglyphics the same way again, knowing they masked a world of constant pain that would make our worst days seem like luxury beyond imagination. So dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together through a world so harsh that simply surviving to age 20 made you one of the lucky ones. Congratulations, you've just woken up in ancient Egypt circa 1250 BCE. The year is irrelevant to you, of course. You simply know it's during the reign of someone called Ramesses II. Not that his name means anything in your daily struggle for survival. The good news is you've awakened in one of history's most advanced civilizations, the land of towering monuments and technical marvels. The bad news: you probably won't survive the week. The first light of dawn hasn't yet broken over the eastern horizon, but you're already awake, not by choice, but from the searing pain of insect bites covering your exposed skin. Mosquitoes have feasted on you throughout the night, each tiny puncture potentially delivering malaria parasites into your bloodstream. You've survived 3 bouts of malarial fever already in your 20 years of life, each episode leaving you slightly weaker than before. The village elder considers you lucky. Half of the children born the same season as you died before reaching their 5th year, many from the brain-swelling form of malaria that kills within days. Your bed is a simple reed mat placed directly on the hard-packed earth floor of your single-room mud brick home. As you move to stand, something skitters across your foot in the darkness, one of the numerous scorpions that infiltrate human dwellings each night seeking warmth. You don't react suddenly. Experience has taught you that quick movements in the dark might disturb something far deadlier, like the Egyptian cobra that killed your neighbor's child last month. Instead, you carefully shake out your simple linen kilt before wrapping it around your waist, a necessary precaution that becomes second nature in a land where venomous creatures claim human lives daily. The smell hits you next, a complex bouquet that would send a modern person retching in seconds. There's the acrid ammonia stench from the shared waste pit in the corner, used throughout the night because venturing outside in darkness means risking snake encounters or predator attacks. This mingles with the musty odor of unwashed bodies, yours included, as bathing in the Nile means exposure to parasitic worms that burrow through skin on contact with water. Layered atop these is the distinctive reek of fish fermenting in clay pots, not from spoilage, but intentional preparation, the rotting fish sauce providing precious protein in your limited diet. Yet your nose doesn't wrinkle at this assault of odors. This tapestry of stenches represents normality, the only atmosphere you've ever known. Around you in the darkness, your family stirs on their own reed mats. Your household consists of 8 people crowded into a space, roughly the size of a modern bathroom. There's your father, considered elderly at 35, his body broken by decades of hauling limestone blocks for building projects. His teeth have been ground to painful nubs by the stone particles in every bite of bread he's consumed throughout his life. Your mother, barely 30, has already borne 7 children, of whom only 3 survived past infancy. Her once straight back is now permanently bent from years of grinding grain on stone querns, an activity that's also worn her finger joints into painful, swollen knots. She coughs frequently, a deep, wet sound that brings up flecks of blood each morning. The family pretends not to notice. Acknowledging the consumption that's slowly killing her would make it real. Your surviving siblings include a brother of 12 and a sister of 9, both already contributing to the family's survival through their labor. Your brother's growth is stunted from chronic malnutrition and intestinal parasites, making him appear closer to 8 years old. His distended belly contrasts sharply with his stick-like limbs, the classic sign of protein deficiency and parasitic infection. Your sister already spends hours daily grinding grain alongside your mother, her small hands developing the same calluses and joint deformities that will plague her for her abbreviated life. The remaining occupants include your elderly grandmother, a miracle of survival at 45, now blind from untreated trachoma infection, her eyelashes having turned inward to scrape her corneas with every blink for decades. She can no longer work the fields, but contributes by watching the youngest children while others labor. Finally, there's your father's brother and his wife, who share this cramped dwelling to pool meager resources, their own children all claimed by disease or predators over the years. Privacy is a concept that would seem bizarre to you. The entire family urinates and defecates in full view of one another in the corner pit. Sexual relations between adult couples occur at night, with only the pretense of others sleeping, the sounds and movements obvious to all on the shared sleeping platform. Menstruation is handled with rags that are rinsed and reused, the blood adding another note to the dwelling's olfactory symphony. As the first hint of dawn lightens the eastern sky, your family's day begins in earnest. No one enjoys the luxury of lingering in bed. The brutal Egyptian sun will soon make fieldwork dangerous, so agricultural labor must begin at first light. Your mother kindles a small fire using precious dried dung fuel, carefully preserved for cooking rather than heating. The morning meal consists of leftover bread from yesterday, a dense, gritty loaf that contains almost as much sand as grain, dipped in a thin porridge of boiled emmer wheat. On special occasions, there might be a portion of salted fish or a few dried fruits, but such luxuries are rare. To put this in perspective, we complain when our favorite cereal is out of stock. The ancient Egyptian considered finding only one insect in their daily bread, a stroke of good fortune. Drinking water comes from a clay jar filled the previous evening from the village well. The water is murky and carries a distinct vegetal smell, but nobody notices. What you can't see are the countless microscopic organisms swimming in that water. Bacteria that cause dysentery, parasitic eggs waiting to hatch inside your intestines, and amoebas that can trigger life-threatening diarrhea. Drinking this water is playing microbiological Russian roulette, but you have no alternative. The family gulps it down without hesitation, their bodies maintaining a tenuous equilibrium with the pathogens they've been exposed to since birth. Morning hygiene is minimal by modern standards. No one bathes daily, water is too precious, and full-body immersion in the Nile carries the risk of parasitic infection or predator attack. Instead, you might wipe your face and hands with a damp cloth, more to remove sleep from your eyes than actual cleaning. Teeth go unbrushed. The concept wouldn't even make sense to you, though wealthy Egyptians do chew aromatic roots to freshen breath. Your breath, like everyone else's, carries the distinctive odor of bacterial colonies flourishing on neglected teeth. Before leaving for the day's labor, specific preparations must be made. Feet must be carefully inspected for cuts or sores that could become infected in the fields. Eyes are sometimes lined with galena, coal, not just for decorative or religious purposes as commonly believed, but because the antimony compound helps protect against eye infections and reduces glare from the punishing desert sun. Everyone checks their simple garments for scorpions or spiders that might have taken up residence overnight. Your family's clothing is minimal and practical, not the elaborate linen garments depicted in temple paintings. Your father and brother wear simple kilts of coarse linen that barely reaches their knees. You and the other men haven't had a chance to shave your heads with the blunt copper razor the family shares. A practice intended not for religious reasons, but for reducing heat and eliminating habitat for lice. Your mother and sister wear straight dresses of the same rough material, typically washed only when the Nile flooding cycle permits extra water. For perspective, we worry about our fashion choices. Ancient Egyptians worried about removing scorpions from their only set of clothes. As your family prepares to depart for their various labors, small protective rituals are observed. Your mother places a crude amulet of Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess, who protects women and children, around your sister's neck. Your father mutters a brief prayer to Osiris for protection in the fields. These aren't merely superstitious gestures. In a world filled with very real dangers and no scientific understanding of what causes disease or injury, these spiritual practices provide the only sense of control available. The sun now crests the horizon, bathing the landscape in golden light that belies the brutal heat to come. Already, neighbors emerge from similar mud brick structures, all heading toward the fields that line the life-giving Nile. The air fills with the sounds of babies crying, donkeys braying, and the occasional barking of the village's semi-wild dogs. Another day of grueling labor begins, with no weekends, no holidays, and no respite beyond the occasional religious festival that merely changes the nature of your work rather than eliminating it. You step out of your dwelling into the narrow dirt path that serves as your village's main street. Immediately, the smell hits you, a heady mixture of animal dung, rotting vegetation, and human waste that makes your home's interior seem pleasant by comparison. Chickens peck at indeterminate scraps in the dirt, while a thin dog slinks past, ribs clearly visible through its mangy coat. The dog isn't a pet in the modern sense. It exists in a semi-wild state, tolerated for its ability to alert villagers to approaching predators or strangers. The village itself consists of perhaps 40 similar mud brick homes arranged haphazardly along the elevated ground that will keep them, mostly, safe when the annual Nile flood comes. Unlike the orderly town planning depicted in idealized Egyptian art, real peasant villages grew organically, with new dwellings crammed wherever space permitted as families expanded. The structures themselves are gradually degrading. Mud brick requires constant maintenance to withstand the elements, and many families lack the resources to make necessary repairs. Between the houses, children already engage in their daily tasks, the youngest gathering dung for fuel, slightly older ones herding geese or caring for infants, while those approaching adolescence head to the fields alongside adults. There are no schools here, no childhood as we would recognize it. From the moment Egyptian children could walk steadily, they became tiny laborers, contributing whatever their limited strength allowed to family survival. Today, your assignment is in the grain fields that stretch from the village to the Nile's edge, where you'll join dozens of other workers harvesting barley. The walk to your designated field takes nearly an hour, the morning sun already baking the exposed skin on your shoulders and back. Along the way, you pass irrigation channels, the lifeblood of Egyptian agriculture and the source of much of the population's parasitic misery. These man-made waterways carry Nile water to fields, but also serve as breeding grounds for mosquitoes and host the snails that carry schistosomiasis. You know from bitter experience to avoid direct contact with this water. 3 seasons ago, you waded into an irrigation channel to clear a blockage and emerged with your legs dripping. Within weeks, you experienced the telltale symptoms: blood in your urine, intense abdominal pain, and debilitating fatigue as the parasitic worms establish themselves in your bladder and intestinal walls. You've carried these unwelcome guests ever since, their eggs tearing microscopic holes in your organs daily, causing internal bleeding and chronic anemia. Arriving at the barley field, you join a row of workers already bent double, harvesting with small bronze sickles. The overseer, not a slave driver with a whip, as popular imagination might suggest, but a fellow villager appointed by local authorities, nods as you take your position. He doesn't need to threaten or coerce. Everyone understands that failure to meet harvesting quotas means collective punishment when tax collectors come. You bend to your task, your spine immediately protesting with familiar pain. The harvesting position, bent forward from the waist, arm extended to cut stalks near the ground, is biomechanically devastating. Modern ergonomists would be horrified by the strain placed on the lower back, but you have no alternative technique. This is how harvest has always been done, how it will always be done. By age 35, your spine will likely show the same degeneration visible in your father's twisted posture. The sickle itself is a brutal tool, a curved bronze blade attached to a wooden handle. After centuries of refinement, it's reasonably efficient at cutting grain, but devastating to the hands that wield it. By day's end, despite calluses built up over years, your palms will be sliced and bleeding from countless small cuts. These wounds, exposed to soil bacteria and fungi, frequently become infected, leading to the characteristic hand deformities visible in many older villagers. As you work, the sun climbs higher, its heat intensifying until the air seems to shimmer. Sweat pours from your body, soaking the simple linen kilt and evaporating almost immediately in the desert air. This evaporative cooling is the only thing preventing heat stroke, but it comes at a cost. Massive loss of body salt and water that must be replaced. Water jugs circulate among the workers, but the liquid is warm and filled with the same pathogens as all water sources. Dysentery is so common during harvest season that workers simply move a few steps away from the grain when intestinal distress strikes, relieve themselves, and return to work. By mid-morning, the temperature has climbed past 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and your muscles scream with fatigue. The grain harvest continues relentlessly, with no formal breaks in the modern sense. Workers might pause briefly to drink water or relieve themselves, but prolonged rest would mean failing to complete the day's assigned section. The overseer doesn't need to threaten punishment. The entire community understands that incomplete harvests mean starvation later. To put this in perspective, we complain if our office air conditioning is set too warm. The ancient Egyptian labored in temperatures that would trigger modern workplace safety shutdowns with no concept that any alternative was possible. The most physically devastating aspect of harvest labor isn't the temperature or even the awkward posture, but the sheer relentlessness of it. From dawn until dusk, you repeat the same motion thousands of times. Bend, cut, gather, straighten briefly to move forward, then bend again. Modern agricultural workers using similar manual techniques rarely last more than a few seasons before seeking alternative employment. You have no such options. This is your life, your inheritance, your future, until your body fails. Archaeological evidence confirms the physical toll this took on Egyptian workers. Skeletal remains from commoner cemeteries show distinctive patterns of spinal degeneration, with vertebrae literally fused together from decades of stress in unnatural positions. Shoulder and hip joints display excessive wear patterns consistent with repetitive load bearing. Feet often show multiple healed fractures from accidents in fields and construction sites. The average Egyptian worker's skeleton at death resembled that of someone decades older by modern standards. As noon approaches, the work pattern shifts slightly. The sun's intensity makes continuous labor dangerous, so the harvesting line moves toward the field's edge, where a few scraggly trees provide minimal shade. Here, workers collapse for a brief respite, consuming the day's main meal. More of the coarse bread, perhaps accompanied by onions, garlic, or a paste made from legumes. The food is barely sufficient to replace the calories burned during morning labor, but it's all that's available. During this rest period, you notice the distinctive symptoms of heat stress among your fellow workers. Several display the bright red flush that precedes heat stroke. Others have stopped sweating entirely, a dangerous sign indicating the body's cooling system has begun to fail. One elderly worker lies unnaturally still, his breathing shallow. By day's end, he might not return to the village, becoming another casualty of Egypt's brutal climate and relentless labor demands. His body will receive minimal ceremonial treatment. Commoners' burials are functional affairs, with bodies simply wrapped in reed mats and placed in shallow graves. To maintain perspective, we consider it a crisis when our phone battery dies. Ancient Egyptians regularly watched fellow workers die from conditions we now prevent with simple hydration protocols and work restrictions. The afternoon work session begins as the sun starts its westward descent, marginally reducing the temperature. Your body protests the return to labor, muscles quivering with fatigue and joints inflamed from the morning's exertion. There's no concept of working through the pain. Pain is simply the default state of existence for an agricultural laborer. Archaeological evidence shows that virtually every adult Egyptian skeleton displays signs of osteoarthritis, even in individuals as young as 25. As you resume harvesting, you feel the distinctive prickle of insect bites across your exposed skin. These aren't merely annoying, each represents potential disease transmission. Flies attracted to the sweat and minor wounds of field workers carry bacteria that cause trachoma, a devastating eye infection that was nearly universal among ancient Egyptians. Mosquitoes deliver malaria and other blood-borne pathogens with each bite. Even ants and beetles contribute to the constant assault, their bites and stings adding to the background noise of continuous physical discomfort. By late afternoon, your hands have developed a fine tremor from muscle fatigue, making the already dangerous sickle work even more hazardous. Accidents become more common as workers tire. To your right, a young man gasps as his sickle slices his opposite forearm rather than the barley stalk he was targeting. Blood flows freely from the wound, which he binds with a strip torn from his kilt. There are no first aid protocols, no tetanus shots, no antibiotics. If infection sets in, and in the microbe-rich environment of Egyptian fields it likely will, his options will be limited to herbal poultices of questionable efficacy, or, in extreme cases, amputation without anesthesia. The monotony of agricultural labor is broken occasionally by hazards that introduce variety, but not relief. A cry goes up from workers near the irrigation channel. A water cobra has been disturbed by the harvesting activity and now moves aggressively toward the work line. Unlike some venomous snakes that prefer to flee human contact, Egyptian cobras often stand their ground, their lethal neurotoxic venom making them one of the region's deadliest inhabitants. Work halts briefly as several men use their sickles to dispatch the threat, the snake's body quickly claimed for its valuable meat. As the sun finally approaches the horizon, the day's labor draws to a close. The overseer inspects the harvested area, making notes on a pottery shard using a simplified writing system accessible to non-scribes. The tally will eventually contribute to tax assessments, with approximately 2/3 of the village's annual grain production claimed by the state and religious institutions. What remains must sustain your community through the year, with minimal reserves for emergencies. The walk back to the village seems twice as long as the morning journey, your legs leaden with fatigue and your lower back spasming from hours bent in an unnatural position. Your skin burns from sun exposure, despite its natural pigmentation and lifelong adaptation to desert conditions. Parts of your linen kilt are stiff with dried blood from hand cuts and scratches accumulated throughout the day. To maintain perspective, after a tiring day, we might treat ourselves to takeout food and streaming entertainment. The ancient Egyptians' reward for backbreaking labor was returning to a filthy, parasite-infested dwelling to consume barely adequate nutrition before collapsing into unconsciousness. But agricultural labor, demanding as it is, represents only one category of physical nightmare in ancient Egypt. Construction work, particularly on monumental projects like temples, palaces, and pyramids, subjected workers to even more extreme conditions. Let's demystify pyramid construction, about which much nonsense has been written. These massive structures weren't built by aliens with advanced technology or by vast armies of slaves driven by whips. The reality was simultaneously more mundane and more horrifying. They were built by massive applications of human muscle, much of it supplied by conscripted peasant labor during agricultural off-seasons. Archaeological evidence from worker villages near pyramid construction sites tells the story clearly. Skeletal remains show patterns of injury consistent with accidents involving massive stone blocks, crushed pelvises, shattered legs, and spinal compression fractures. Muscle attachment sites on bones indicate development of specific muscle groups far beyond normal agricultural workers, suggesting specialized roles in the construction process. The conscription system known as corvée labor required villages to provide workers for royal projects during the annual Nile flooding, when fields were underwater and agricultural work paused. These weren't technically slaves, but weren't free laborers either. Refusal to participate could result in severe punishment or increased village tax burdens. Workers were organized into teams that competed against each other, with moderate incentives like extra beer rations for exceeding quotas. The physical tasks involved in pyramid construction defy modern comprehension. Limestone blocks weighing between 2.5 and 15 tons needed to be moved from quarries, transported across the Nile, and then dragged up progressively steeper inclines as the structure rose. Teams of 20 to 60 men would be harnessed to a single block, pulling in unison on ropes that cut into their shoulders and backs, creating distinctive wear patterns visible in skeletal remains. Temperature conditions at construction sites regularly exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit, with workers exposed directly to the sun on the treeless Giza Plateau. Dust from limestone cutting and grinding filled workers' lungs, creating silicosis-like conditions that reduced lung capacity and eventually led to respiratory failure. Water supplies were limited and often contaminated, causing chronic diarrheal diseases that further weakened already stressed bodies. To put things in perspective, modern OSHA regulations would immediately shut down working conditions comparable to pyramid construction. The ancient Egyptian system considered it acceptable to lose hundreds of workers to accidents, heat stress, and disease during major building projects. The specific physical toll varied by construction role. Quarry workers developed distinctive shoulder and arm deformities from swinging copper chisels thousands of times daily against stone. They also showed higher rates of blindness from stone chips flying into eyes. Transport workers displayed extreme development of leg, back, and shoulder muscles, along with compressed spines and herniated discs from pulling massive loads. Masons who shaped and fitted blocks suffered hand deformities and respiratory ailments from constant exposure to stone dust. Accidents were catastrophically common. A block dropping during lifting might crush multiple workers simultaneously. Ropes breaking under tension could cause massive injuries from sudden releases of energy. Falls became increasingly common and deadly as structures rose higher. Archaeological evidence suggests that serious accidents might kill or maim dozens of workers at once, with bodies sometimes incorporated directly into fill material rather than transported for proper burial when projects fell behind schedule. The Great Pyramid of Giza contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, each requiring cutting, transportation, lifting, and placement. Modern engineering estimates suggest that even with efficient organization and continuous work, the structure would require approximately 20 years to complete, matching historical records. This represents over 100 million person-hours of grueling physical labor, performed without powered machinery, in extreme environmental conditions, with minimal safety protocols. The human cost of these monumental projects extended beyond the construction site. Villages supplying corvée labor lost significant productive capacity when able-bodied workers departed for royal projects. Many never returned, succumbing to accidents or diseases contracted in the densely populated worker camps. Others returned permanently disabled, becoming dependents rather than contributors to family survival. The psychological trauma of watching team members crushed by falling blocks or dying slowly from internal injuries left invisible but lasting damage. Other specialized occupations carried their own distinctive physical horrors. Metal workers, especially those working with copper, suffered chronic metal poisoning from inhaling fumes during smelting and casting. Their skeletons show elevated copper levels in bone tissue, along with neurological damage indicators consistent with heavy metal toxicity. Many developed tremors, cognitive impairments, and eventually fatal organ failures. Textile workers, predominantly women, develop specialized repetitive stress injuries from the constant small muscle movements required for spinning and weaving. Their skeletal remains show distinctive wear patterns in finger joints, along with spinal deformities from sitting in awkward positions for thousands of hours. The lint produced during flax processing created respiratory conditions similar to modern brown lung disease among cotton workers. The invisible enemies within, parasites and disease. If the back-breaking labor doesn't kill you outright, the microscopic predators lurking in every drop of water and grain of soil are patiently waiting their turn. Modern mummy analysis has revealed a horrifying truth that changes our entire understanding of ancient Egyptian life. Parasitic infection was nearly universal, with most individuals hosting not just one, but multiple parasitic species simultaneously throughout their lives. Let's begin with the most notorious, schistosomiasis, a parasitic infection so intimately connected with Egyptian life that it's been called the disease of the Nile. Mummified remains show that approximately 98% of examined ancient Egyptians carried these parasites, making them nearly as universal as death itself. The infection begins innocuously enough. You wade into an irrigation canal or the Nile itself to bathe, collect water, or work the shadoof. within seconds, not minutes or hours, but literally seconds. Microscopic fork-tailed cercariae larvae, released by freshwater snails, detect your body heat and chemical signature. They swarm toward you, penetrating your skin using digestive enzymes that allow them to slip through intact skin without you feeling a thing. This isn't a rare occurrence requiring special circumstances. Any water contact virtually guarantees massive exposure. Once inside your body, these larvae transform and migrate through your bloodstream into your liver, where they mature into adult worms up to a centimeter long. Male and female worms then couple together, the female nestling into a groove in the male's body, and travel to blood vessels surrounding either your intestines or bladder, depending on the specific species. There, they begin producing hundreds of eggs daily, many of which become trapped in surrounding tissues. These eggs are the true agents of destruction. Equipped with sharp spines, they gradually tear through organ walls, causing chronic internal bleeding. Your immune system's response creates inflammatory granulomas around the eggs, eventually leading to fibrosis that blocks blood vessels and damages organs. The symptoms: chronic bloody urine or diarrhea, depending on which species has infected you. Pain becomes your constant companion as the eggs systematically destroy your organs from within. Let's put this in perspective. Modern Americans panic at the sight of blood in their urine or stool, immediately seeking medical attention. For ancient Egyptians, passing blood was so common, it was considered a normal bodily function. Medical papyri actually describe bloody urine as male menstruation. So ubiquitous, it was considered a regular physiological process rather than a symptom of disease. But schistosomiasis is merely the beginning of your parasitic nightmare. Let's discuss the guinea worm, or Dracunculus metanensis, a creature so horrific it may have been the inspiration for the serpent symbol in the rod of Asclepius, still used to represent medicine today. Infection begins when you drink water containing tiny copepods, water fleas, that harbor guinea worm larvae. Your stomach acid dissolves the water fleas, releasing the larvae which penetrate your intestinal wall and migrate through your body tissues. Over the next year, yes, an entire year, the female worm grows inside you, eventually reaching up to 1 meter, 3 feet in length. When mature and fertilized, she migrates to just beneath the skin, typically in the legs or feet. There, she creates an intensely painful, burning blister. When you instinctively submerge the affected area in water-seeking relief, the blister ruptures, and the worm releases thousands of larvae into the water, beginning the cycle again. But your suffering is far from over. The worm must now exit your body, emerging a few centimeters each day in a process that can take weeks or even months. The traditional extraction method, still used in remaining endemic regions today, involves slowly winding the worm around a stick, a few centimeters per day. Careful not to break the worm, which would cause severe inflammatory reactions. This excruciating, time-consuming process renders you essentially disabled, unable to work or walk normally. Mummified remains show evidence of guinea worm calcification in tissues, and ancient Egyptian medical texts describe treatments for fiery serpents under the skin, almost certainly references to guinea worm infection. Multiple infections were common, with individuals hosting several worms emerging simultaneously from different sites on the body. Perhaps even more ubiquitous were intestinal parasites. Microscopic examination of mummified intestinal contents reveals eggs from multiple species of parasitic worms in nearly every sample. Tapeworms reaching up to 30 feet in length colonized intestines, absorbing nutrients before their host could use them. Hookworms attached to intestinal walls, drinking blood and causing severe anemia. Whipworms and roundworms competed for space in already compromised digestive systems. The effects were devastating. Children developed distended bellies, not from malnutrition alone, but from massive worm burdens, taking up physical space within their abdomens. Growth was stunted, as parasites stole nutrients needed for development. Cognitive function suffered from chronic anemia, as hookworms drained blood day after day, year after year. To make matters worse, Egyptian medical treatments often exacerbated these conditions. Remedies typically involved either ineffective herbal preparations or actively harmful applications of substances like lead compounds or animal dung, introducing secondary infections on top of existing parasitic burdens. Then there were the external parasites that made every moment an exercise in discomfort. Head and body lice were so universal that they were simply accepted as part of human existence. These weren't occasional visitors but permanent companions, their eggs visible in the hair of virtually every mummified head examined. The constant itching and secondary skin infections they caused were simply background noise in a symphony of suffering. Eye infections deserve special mention, particularly trachoma, a bacterial infection spread by flies and close contact that remains one of the leading causes of preventable blindness worldwide. In ancient Egypt, this infection was nearly universal. Its progression is particularly horrific. Repeated infections cause scarring of the inner eyelid, eventually causing the eyelashes to turn inward and scratch against the cornea with every blink. Every time you close your eyes, your own eyelashes sandpaper your cornea, gradually scraping it opaque. Evidence suggests up to 50% of ancient Egyptians experienced some degree of vision impairment, with complete blindness common among older individuals. Imagine a population where half the people you meet have visibly damaged eyes, many completely blind from infections that today would be treated with a simple antibiotic ointment. Malaria requires its own discussion, as its impact on Egyptian life was profound. Spread by mosquitoes breeding in the very irrigation systems that made agriculture possible, malaria infected virtually the entire population repeatedly throughout life. Unlike some modern strains that may cause a single acute illness, the Plasmodium species endemic to ancient Egypt caused recurring episodes of high fever, violent chills, delirium, and extreme fatigue. These episodes returned regularly, every 48 to 72 hours during acute phases, gradually wearing down even the strongest individuals. Children were particularly vulnerable to cerebral malaria, which caused brain swelling and often death. Those who survived multiple infections developed enlarged spleens and chronic anemia, their bodies permanently damaged by the parasite's life cycle. What made the ancient Egyptian parasitic burden truly unique was not just the presence of these infections, but their multiplicity. Modern medical analysis of mummies reveals individuals simultaneously hosting schistosomiasis, multiple intestinal worms, malaria parasites, and external parasites, a polyparasitism that created compounding effects far worse than any single infection. To put this in perspective, most modern humans in developed nations may experience a few parasitic infections, like pinworms, in their lifetime, each treated quickly with effective medications. Ancient Egyptians hosted 5 to 8 different parasitic species, continuously from early childhood until death, each one draining resources from an already nutritionally stressed body, with no effective treatments available. The psychological impact of this constant parasitism cannot be overstated. Imagine living in a body that is never truly your own, always shared with creatures visibly emerging from your skin, blood appearing in your excretions daily, persistent itching from surface dwellers, and the knowledge that any water contact brings more invaders. This wasn't occasional misfortune, but the constant, inescapable reality of Egyptian existence. Eating yourself to death, the Egyptian diet. If parasites and backbreaking labor weren't enough to make your Egyptian existence a waking nightmare, the very act of eating, supposedly life-sustaining, was itself slowly killing you in particularly agonizing ways. Let's begin with the staple food that formed the foundation of every Egyptian meal: bread. Bread production in ancient Egypt involved a process so fundamentally flawed that it guaranteed slow, painful dental destruction for every single person, regardless of social class. The process began with grain grinding using stone querns, 2 rough stones rubbed against each other with grain in between. This method inevitably incorporated small stone particles into the flour, not occasionally or in trace amounts, but in quantities significant enough to be immediately visible in microscopic analysis of preserved bread. Every bite of Egyptian bread contained what amounted to sand and tiny rock fragments. With each chew, these particles acted like industrial sandpaper against tooth enamel. The result? A slow, lifelong process of dental obliteration that began in childhood and continued until death, or until all teeth were completely destroyed, whichever came first. Modern dental analysis of mummies tells the devastating story. By age 30, most ancient Egyptians had worn their teeth down to the pulp cavity, the sensitive inner portion containing nerves and blood vessels. Imagine the constant, excruciating pain of exposed dental nerves, not for days or weeks, but for years or decades. Every bite, every drink, every breath of cold air would send lightning bolts of agony through your jaw. This wasn't a condition affecting only the poor or malnourished. Even royal mummies show the same pattern of severe dental wear. Amenhotep III, among the most powerful pharaohs in history, had teeth ground down to flat stumps by his 40s. Not even unlimited wealth and power could protect you from this particular Egyptian horror. The consequences went far beyond mere toothaches. As teeth wore down to the nerves, infections became inevitable. Dental abscesses formed, creating pockets of infection that drained into the sinuses or jawbone. These infections didn't just stay in the mouth, they spread. Mummified remains frequently show evidence of dental abscesses that penetrated the jawbone, entered the bloodstream, and contributed to fatal sepsis. Let's put this in perspective. Today, we consider a single exposed nerve in one tooth to be an emergency requiring immediate professional intervention and powerful pain medication. Ancient Egyptians routinely lived with multiple exposed nerves in their mouths simultaneously, with absolutely no effective pain management options available. The best they could hope for was extraction, performed without anesthesia, using primitive bronze forceps, often breaking the tooth and leaving roots behind to cause further infection. By middle age, many Egyptians could only consume soft foods or liquids, their ability to chew solid food completely destroyed along with their dentition. This dietary limitation further compromised nutrition, creating a downward spiral of malnutrition that exacerbated other health problems. Examination of middle-aged mummies frequently reveals evidence of nutritional deficiencies directly attributable to the inability to properly chew food. The horrors of Egyptian bread extend beyond dental destruction. The grain itself was often contaminated with ergot fungus, which contains powerful hallucinogens and vasoconstrictors. Regular consumption of ergot-contaminated bread caused symptoms ranging from vivid hallucinations to restricted blood flow severe enough to cause gangrene in extremities. Some Egyptologists suggest that certain religious visions and experiences may have actually been ergot poisoning episodes. Moving beyond bread, let's examine the rest of the Egyptian diet. Despite the fertile Nile Valley's agricultural abundance, nutritional deficiencies were rampant across all social classes. Modern analysis of mummified tissues shows evidence of scurvy, vitamin C deficiency, rickets, vitamin D deficiency, and pellagra, niacin deficiency, conditions that cause bleeding gums, bone deformation, and severe skin lesions respectively. How could a civilization with abundant agriculture experience such widespread malnutrition? The answer lies in both distribution problems and food preservation limitations. While Egypt produced substantial food quantities, access was highly unequal. Temple records document massive stockpiles in granaries, while common people experienced regular seasonal hunger, particularly during the months before harvest. Preservation methods created their own health hazards. Without refrigeration, Egyptians relied heavily on drying, salting, and fermentation to preserve foods. Fish and meat were often preserved with astronomical quantities of salt, levels that would cause immediate hypertension and kidney damage in modern consumers. Analysis of mummified kidney tissues shows evidence of widespread renal disease consistent with extreme salt consumption. Fermentation introduced different health problems. Beer was safer to drink than water, but archaeological evidence suggests significant contamination during production. Containers used for beer brewing show evidence of harmful bacterial and fungal species that would have caused regular gastrointestinal distress, ranging from diarrhea to potential liver damage. Let's discuss water consumption, or more accurately, the near impossibility of consuming safe water in ancient Egypt. The Nile and its irrigation channels served simultaneously as water source, bathing facility, trash disposal, and toilet. Every drop of water you drank contained a teeming microscopic ecosystem of bacteria, parasites, and contaminants. This wasn't occasional contamination, but a permanent condition. Every single drink carried potential killers: dysentery, cholera, typhoid, polio, and countless other waterborne illnesses. The archaeological record shows evidence of these infections in virtually every examined mummy. Intestinal samples contain identifiable pathogens in such quantities that gastrointestinal illness wasn't an occasional misfortune, but a constant companion. Food storage created additional health hazards. Grain was typically stored in large ceramic containers or mud brick granaries, ideal environments for mold growth and rodent infestation. Mold production included dangerous mycotoxins, while rodent urine and feces introduced additional pathogens. Every handful of stored grain contained trace amounts of rodent excrement, toxic mold, and insect parts. Speaking of insects, they constituted an unwanted protein supplement in virtually every meal. Without modern pest control, food preparation and storage areas teemed with flies, beetles, and other insects. Their eggs, larvae, and body parts became incorporated into foods at every stage of preparation. Microscopic analysis of preserved stomach contents reveals insect parts in nearly every examined sample, not occasional accidents, but routine dietary components. Meat consumption presents another dimension of Egyptian dietary horror. Contrary to popular belief, most Egyptians rarely ate meat, with consumption limited by both availability and cost. When meat was available to common people, it was often from questionable sources: animals that died from disease, carrion scavenged by the desperately hungry, or meats preserved well past the point of significant decomposition. Even the elite, with access to fresher meat, weren't spared food-related suffering. Egyptian animal husbandry practices included force feeding to fatten livestock rapidly, resulting in animals with fatty liver disease and other stress-related conditions. Examination of food remains from elite tombs shows evidence of diseased animal tissues that would never pass modern food safety inspection. For the average Egyptian, the eating experience was one of constant compromise between hunger and harm. Each meal presented a choice between potential starvation and consuming foods that inflicted immediate dental agony while introducing new pathogens, parasites, and toxins into an already compromised body. To put this in perspective, modern consumers panic about trace amounts of pesticides or preservatives in foods, while ancient Egyptians routinely consumed meals containing visible mold, insect parts, rodent feces, and stone fragments, washed down with water teeming with bacteria and parasites, not by choice, but because no alternatives existed. The long-term consequences of this dietary reality are visible in every mummified remain: dental destruction, chronic gastrointestinal inflammation, parasitic burden, liver disease, kidney damage, all directly attributable to the simple act of eating. For ancient Egyptians, nourishment and poison were inseparable companions, each meal simultaneously sustaining life and hastening death. Surviving childhood, the miracle. Few achieved. While modern parents worry about car seat installations and organic baby food options, ancient Egyptian parents faced a far more fundamental concern: whether their child would survive at all. The statistics are so grim, they're difficult to comprehend through a modern lens. Archaeological evidence from cemetery excavations tells us that approximately 50% of all children born in ancient Egypt died before reaching age 5. In periods of famine or epidemic disease, this percentage climbed even higher. Your journey into this hostile world began with childbirth itself, an event so dangerous that Egyptian women prepared for it by writing wills and saying goodbye to loved ones. The maternal mortality rate hovered around 15 to 20% per birth. Since the average Egyptian woman experienced 6 to 8 pregnancies during her lifetime, the cumulative risk was staggering. A woman beginning her reproductive years had approximately a 50-50 chance of eventually dying in childbirth. Let's examine what Egyptian childbirth actually entailed. Pregnant women received no prenatal care as we understand it. Instead, pregnancy was managed through a combination of folk remedies, many actively harmful, and religious rituals focused on appeasing deities associated with childbirth, particularly the fearsome goddess Taweret, depicted as a pregnant hippopotamus with lion attributes, a fitting symbol for the terrifying nature of Egyptian birth. When labor began, women gave birth in specialized positions designed to use gravity to aid delivery, typically squatting on birth bricks or special chairs with openings in the seat. While this position was biomechanically sound, everything else about the process invited disaster. Midwives had no means of managing complications like breech presentation, placenta previa, or postpartum hemorrhage. Their tools consisted primarily of ritual objects and basic cutting implements for the umbilical cord. Medical papyri describe treatments for birth complications that ranged from ineffective to actively harmful, applying donkey dung to the vaginal opening, for instance, or fumigation of the birth canal with burned bird remains. These treatments introduced dangerous bacteria into an already vulnerable area, virtually guaranteeing infection. If both mother and child survived birth itself, the dangers were just beginning. Infant care practices were based on tradition rather than effectiveness. Newborns were immediately rubbed with salt to toughen their skin, a practice that caused painful dehydration and sometimes chemical burns to delicate newborn tissue. They were then tightly swaddled in linen strips that restricted movement and development, often secured so tightly that circulatory issues developed in tiny limbs. The first critical challenge was feeding. While breastfeeding was common, maternal malnutrition often meant inadequate milk production. Egyptian medical texts describe various substances used to increase mother's milk, most containing herbs with little effect or actively harmful compounds. Infants whose mothers couldn't produce sufficient milk faced grim prospects. Animal milk was an imperfect substitute, contaminated with bacteria and lacking essential nutrients. Primitive feeding implements, unglazed pottery vessels with reed nipples, were impossible to properly clean, becoming bacteria breeding grounds. Supplementary foods introduced to infants were nutritional disasters by modern standards. Archaeological examination of coprolites, preserved feces, from infant burials shows early introduction of adult foods unsuitable for developing digestive systems, often contaminated with the same parasites and pathogens that plagued adults. Weaning typically occurred around age 3, a protective practice that provided maternal antibodies as long as possible, but even this couldn't shield children from the onslaught of environmental threats. Those first critical weeks of life presented relentless hazards. Tetanus from umbilical cord infection, neonatal tetanus, was common enough to have its own designation in medical texts. The practice of applying dung or mud to the cut cord, intended to stop bleeding, introduced the very bacteria that caused this invariably fatal condition. Symptoms typically appeared about a week after birth, the newborn developing increasingly severe muscle spasms, inability to nurse, and eventually dying in excruciating pain from respiratory failure as chest muscles seized. Assuming a child survived these immediate threats, infectious disease presented the next major hurdle. Without vaccines or antibiotics, diseases now considered preventable ravaged the youngest Egyptians. Examination of child mummies and skeletal remains reveals evidence of measles, smallpox, polio, diphtheria, and numerous other infectious diseases that left distinctive markers on tissues. Polio deserves special mention. Evidence of this devastating viral infection appears throughout Egyptian archaeological records. Skeletal remains show the characteristic asymmetrical paralysis affecting primarily children. Some mummies display the twisted limbs and muscle atrophy typical of polio survivors. Perhaps most telling is the artistic evidence. Numerous depictions of individuals with withered limbs and walking sticks, including the famous image of a doorkeeper with the characteristic dropped foot of polio. The Egyptians had no understanding of the viral nature of polio. Its sudden appearance, often affecting multiple children in the same community simultaneously, seemed almost supernatural. Without modern supportive care, those with bulbar polio, affecting the respiratory muscles, died quickly of suffocation. Those with limb paralysis who survived faced lifelong disability in a world utterly unequipped to accommodate physical limitations. Parasitic infections hit children particularly hard. Their developing immune systems couldn't effectively fight the multiple parasitic species that invaded their bodies through water, food, and soil contact. The results were devastating. Children developed distended bellies not from simple malnutrition, but from massive worm burdens physically filling their intestines. Chronic anemia from blood-feeding parasites like hookworms prevented normal brain development, permanently affecting cognitive function. Evidence from child mummies shows that virtually all Egyptian children hosted multiple parasitic species simultaneously. One particularly well-preserved child mummy, dated to approximately 1000 BCE, contained evidence of schistosomiasis, two types of intestinal worms and external parasites. a polyparasitism that would overwhelm even a healthy adult immune system, let alone a developing child's. Childhood nutritional status compounded these challenges. While Egypt's agricultural output was substantial, food distribution was highly unequal, and seasonal shortages affected the most vulnerable first. Skeletal remains of children show distinctive growth arrest lines, visible bands and bones that form during periods of severe malnutrition or illness. These lines appear with such regularity that archaeologists can track community-wide food shortages through their presence in children's remains. Specific nutritional deficiencies left permanent marks. Rickets, caused by vitamin D deficiency, created the characteristic bowed legs and deformed rib cages visible in many child skeletons. This seems paradoxical in a sun-drenched country like Egypt, but cultural practices that kept children, especially girls, covered and indoors limited sun exposure necessary for vitamin D production. Iron deficiency anemia, evidenced by distinctive porous lesions on the skull called porotic hyperostosis, appears in approximately 50% of examined child remains. For children who survived these biological threats, physical dangers waited at every turn. There were no child-proofed environments, no safety standards, and minimal supervision as parents worked. Archaeological evidence tells tragic stories through skeletal trauma. Accidental drownings in irrigation canals were common enough to feature in warning tales. Falls from heights, animal attacks, and burns from cooking fires left distinctive injury patterns on child remains. Perhaps most shocking to modern sensibilities is how early childhood ended. By age 4 or 5, children were expected to contribute economically to household survival. Archaeological evidence shows distinctive skeletal markers of child labor, vertebral compression, premature arthritis, and repetitive stress injuries in remains of children as young as 6. Young boys might be assigned to scare birds from fields or assist with animal herding. Girls began apprenticing in household tasks, grinding grain, carrying water, and caring for younger siblings. For children of specialized craftspeople, apprenticeship began early and carried specific occupational hazards. Child remains found near pottery workshops show evidence of silicosis from inhaling ceramic dust. Those associated with metalworking sites display lead and copper poisoning markers. These weren't exceptional cases, but the normal experience of Egyptian childhood, early introduction to labor that would gradually destroy their bodies. Educational opportunities, where they existed at all, were physical ordeals themselves. The limited evidence available about ancient Egyptian education suggests teaching methods based primarily on memorization enforced through physical punishment. Scribal schools, the most elite educational option, used beatings as standard pedagogical tools. One instructional text advises teachers, "A boy's ear is on his back. He listens when he is beaten." To put childhood in perspective, modern parents carefully monitor developmental milestones and provide enrichment activities for optimal growth. Ancient Egyptian children, who simply survived to age 10 with all limbs intact and without permanent disability from disease, were considered extraordinarily fortunate, regardless of developmental outcomes. The psychological impact of growing up in an environment where death was an everyday companion is difficult to overstate. Children routinely witness siblings die, often horribly, from preventable conditions. They understood from earliest consciousness that their own survival was uncertain. Religious practices and protective amulets worn by children weren't decorative, but desperate attempts to ward off the countless threats surrounding them. Perhaps most telling is how Egyptian culture adapted to this reality. Parents often delayed naming infants until survival seemed likely. Investment in individual children increased gradually with age, a psychological protection against the grief of frequent loss. The elaborate mortuary preparations that characterized Egyptian culture weren't mere spiritual practices, but responses to a world where child death was so commonplace, it required systematic management of both practical and emotional aftermath. The net effect of all these factors was a childhood utterly foreign to modern understanding, not a protected period of development and discovery, but a gauntlet of survival requiring extraordinary resilience from those fortunate enough to reach adulthood at all. The animal kingdom's vendetta against humans. While parasites and diseases waged invisible war against Egyptians from within, a more visible array of predators lurked in every environment, from the Nile waters to village homes. Ancient Egypt's fauna wasn't comprised of friendly creatures coexisting peacefully with humans, as often depicted in romanticized art. It was an ecosystem of killers that viewed humans as either prey or competition, posing daily threats that modern people rarely encounter outside of controlled zoo environments. Let's begin with the Nile River itself, the lifeblood of Egyptian civilization that simultaneously served as home to one of history's most efficient predators, the Nile crocodile. These weren't the relatively modest specimens seen in modern zoos. Archaeological and paleontological evidence indicates Nile crocodiles commonly reach lengths of 20 feet or more, with some exceptional individuals growing larger. A full-grown Nile crocodile could easily drag an adult human underwater, and frequently did. The Nile crocodile is unique among predators for actively hunting humans as preferred prey. Unlike sharks or big cats that occasionally attack humans but generally prefer other food sources, crocodiles evolved specific hunting strategies targeted at human behavior patterns. They learned to lurk near water collection points, laundry areas, and river crossings, anywhere humans predictably approached the water's edge. Their hunting technique was devastatingly effective. Crocodiles would remain nearly invisible, with only their eyes and nostrils breaking the water's surface. When a human approached within striking distance, typically about half the crocodile's body length, they would explode from the water with surprising speed, grabbing the victim and performing a death roll to both drown their prey and tear off consumable chunks. Egyptian medical papyri catalog crocodile injuries with matter-of-fact regularity, describing treatments for partial limb loss and distinctive bite patterns. Archaeological evidence bears this out. Numerous skeletal remains show characteristic crocodile tooth marks and trauma patterns consistent with their attack methods. Some remains show evidence of survivors who lived years after losing limbs or suffering massive tissue damage from crocodile attacks. The threat was so pervasive that many Egyptian communities posted dedicated crocodile spotters at water access points, people whose sole job was to watch for submerged predators while others collected water or washed clothing. Despite these precautions, historical records and modern estimates suggest crocodiles killed hundreds of Egyptians annually in each major settlement area, a death toll comparable to a significant modern disease outbreak, yet accepted as a routine feature of existence. While crocodiles represented the most iconic Nile predator, they weren't the most dangerous. That distinction belongs to the hippopotamus, responsible for more human deaths in ancient Egypt than any other animal. Modern wildlife experts still rank hippos among Africa's deadliest animals, killing an estimated 500 people annually across the continent. In ancient Egypt, with denser hippo populations and more human-hippo interaction, the death toll was significantly higher. What made hippos particularly deadly was their combination of immense strength, aggressive territorial behavior, and deceptive speed. Despite weighing up to 4,000 pounds, hippos can run at 30 miles per hour, faster than the fastest human sprinter. They routinely capsize boats, often biting victims in half with jaws capable of exerting 2,000 pounds of pressure per square inch. Unlike crocodiles, which typically attack for food, hippos attack out of territorial aggression, often continuing to maul victims rather than consuming them. Archaeological evidence shows distinctive hippo attack patterns, massive crushing trauma to skeletons, often with distinctive tooth marks on surviving bone fragments. Egyptian art and literature make frequent reference to hippo attacks, depicting them as manifestations of chaos and destruction. The god Seth, associated with chaos and violence, was often depicted partially in hippo form, precisely because Egyptians understood the animal's destructive capabilities firsthand. Water-based threats extended beyond these large predators. The Nile housed numerous venomous fish and invertebrates whose stings and bites caused effects ranging from excruciating pain to tissue necrosis and death. Stonefish, with their nearly perfect camouflage and potent neurotoxin, lurked in shallow waters frequented by humans. Certain catfish species possessed venom glands at the base of their spines, delivering toxins when stepped on or handled. Even relatively benign-seeming creatures, like Nile tilapia, could inflict devastating wounds with their powerful jaws when defending nests. Stepping out of the water didn't guarantee safety. The land surrounding the Nile presented its own deadly menagerie, beginning with Egypt's impressive collection of venomous snakes. The Egyptian cobra, Najahaje, the same species associated with Cleopatra's legendary suicide, can deliver enough neurotoxic venom in a single bite to kill an adult within hours. These snakes frequently entered human dwellings, seeking rodents or shelter, making nocturnal bathroom visits a potentially lethal activity. Even more dangerous was the saw-scaled viper, responsible for more human deaths in the region than any other snake species. Unlike cobras, which generally prefer avoidance and display warning behaviors before striking, saw-scaled vipers are aggressive, quick to attack, and possess hemotoxic venom that destroys tissue and prevents blood clotting. The distinctive rasping sound they make by rubbing their scales together, often the last thing victims heard before being bitten, gave rise to numerous superstitions about death whispers in Egyptian folklore. Desert horned vipers presented unique dangers with their specialized ambush hunting technique. These snakes would bury themselves in sand, with only their horned eyes exposed, striking at passing humans or animals. Their camouflage was so effective that Egyptian workers developed the practice of pouring water on sandy paths before walking, causing these snakes to move and reveal themselves. Snake encounters weren't rare misfortunes, but daily concerns, particularly in rural areas. Archaeological evidence suggests snakebite may have caused up to 5% of all deaths in some regions. Egyptian medical papyri devote extensive sections to snakebite treatments, most ineffective or actively harmful, such as applying human excrement to bite wounds or consuming various toxic concoctions meant to drive out the venom. Scorpions represented an even more pervasive threat, as they actively sought human dwellings for shelter. Unlike snakes, which generally enter homes incidentally while hunting, scorpions preferentially establish themselves in the dark corners of human structures. The fat-tailed scorpion, common throughout Egypt, possesses venom potent enough to kill a child with a single sting and cause excruciating pain in adults. Archaeological evidence, including preserved scorpions found in ancient dwellings, suggests the average Egyptian home hosted 8 to 10 scorpions at any given time, lurking in bedding, clothing, and stored food. Egyptians developed elaborate protective rituals, including specialized anti-scorpion spells and statues of the goddess Serket. But these spiritual precautions did nothing to deter the actual arachnids that claimed dozens of lives in each village annually, particularly among children. Let's put this in perspective. Modern Americans might encounter a potentially dangerous spider every few years and consider it a noteworthy event. Ancient Egyptians expected to find lethal scorpions in their homes weekly, sometimes daily, and considered this normal. Shaking out clothing and bedding before use wasn't occasional prudence, but a fundamental survival habit, as necessary and automatic as looking both ways before crossing a street is to modern humans. The insect world presented its own array of dangers beyond disease transmission. Certain ant species, particularly the siafu, or driver ant, formed colonies of millions that conducted coordinated hunts across wide territories. These carnivorous swarms would overtake villages during nocturnal raids, consuming anything edible, including immobilized humans such as infants, the elderly, or intoxicated adults. Egyptian folklore contains numerous references to devouring ant armies that correspond precisely to documented driver ant behavior. Desert regions beyond the Nile Valley harbored additional predators. Lions, once common throughout Egypt, regularly attacked outlying settlements, particularly during drought periods when natural prey became scarce. Unlike modern African lions, which rarely view humans as prey, ancient Egyptian lions had learned that human settlements provided reliable hunting. Archaeological evidence includes numerous human remains showing characteristic big cat predation patterns, crushing skull bites, and distinctive claw marks on surviving bones. Leopards, though less common than lions, presented special dangers due to their preference for dragging prey into trees before consuming it. Children were particularly vulnerable to leopard predation, as they represented manageable prey that could be easily carried off. Egyptian protective amulets for children frequently depicted feline predators, reflecting this very real threat. Even the air itself harbored deadly creatures. Egypt hosts several species of wasps and hornets capable of delivering fatal stings, particularly to allergic individuals or when attacking in swarms. The oriental hornet, common throughout the region, builds massive underground nests that ancient Egyptians might disturb during agricultural activities, triggering defensive attacks involving hundreds or thousands of insects simultaneously. Domesticated animals, supposedly allies in human survival, added their own chapter to this litany of threats. Egyptian cattle, while essential for agriculture, caused numerous human deaths through goring and trampling incidents. Working animals were often malnourished and mistreated, making them unpredictable and dangerous. Archaeological remains show distinctive trauma patterns consistent with cattle attacks, primarily puncture wounds to the abdomen and crushing injuries to the chest. Dogs, while valued for hunting and protection, carried rabies with disturbing frequency. Once contracted, rabies was invariably fatal, leading to a particularly horrific death involving progressive paralysis, hydrophobia, fear of water, and eventual respiratory failure. Egyptian medical texts describe rabies with chilling accuracy, demonstrating its common occurrence. The absence of any effective treatment meant that a single bite from an infected animal represented an automatic death sentence, typically delivered over excruciating weeks as the virus gradually destroyed the victim's nervous system. Perhaps most unsettling is how Egyptian culture normalized these constant animal threats. Religious practices incorporated many dangerous creatures as deities or their manifestations, not from ignorance of their dangers, but from intimate familiarity with their deadly capabilities. Gods associated with protection frequently took forms of the very animals Egyptians most feared: Sobek, the crocodile god; Serket, the scorpion goddess; Sekhmet, the lion-headed destroyer. This wasn't primitive superstition, but a sophisticated psychological adaptation to constant threat. By deifying the animals most likely to kill them, Egyptians created frameworks for both respectful avoidance and ritualized control. Unable to eliminate these dangers through physical means, they developed elaborate spiritual technologies aimed at negotiating with the forces these animals represented. To put all this in perspective, modern humans typically encounter potentially dangerous animals in controlled environments like zoos or during specific wilderness activities for which they've prepared. Ancient Egyptians navigated a world where lethal predators were not exceptional encounters, but constant companions in daily life. The psychological burden of this perpetual threat, knowing that every water collection trip might end in crocodile attack, every nighttime bathroom visit might lead to snakebite, every agricultural task might disturb a lethal hornet nest, created a relationship with the natural world fundamentally different from modern experience. The cumulative effect was a population that never knew true safety from predation. Even in sleep, Egyptians remained vulnerable to scorpions, snakes, and other creatures seeking warmth or shelter in human dwellings. This constant threat level creates a kind of hypervigilance that modern humans rarely experience outside of combat zones. Yet for ancient Egyptians, this was simply the baseline condition of existence, from birth until death or disabling injury. This reality illuminates Egyptian obsession with protective magic and religious practices focused on controlling natural forces. These weren't superstitious accessories to daily life, but essential psychological tools for managing existence in an environment where multiple species actively hunted humans as preferred prey. When every day included navigating through territories claimed by creatures evolved specifically to kill you, spiritual protection became as necessary as physical shelter. Medical care that often killed you faster. If you've managed to survive the backbreaking labor, parasite infestations, dietary destruction, and animal attacks that characterize daily Egyptian life, you might hope that medical treatment would offer some relief when illness or injury inevitably struck. Unfortunately, Egyptian medicine represented yet another domain where the cure was often worse than the disease, delivering treatments so misguided that many accelerated death rather than preventing it. Popular culture has perpetuated a myth of advanced Egyptian medical knowledge, focusing selectively on their surgical techniques and extensive pharmacopoeia. The reality, revealed through careful analysis of medical papyri and mummified remains, presents a far grimmer picture. A medical system combining occasional effective treatments with actively harmful practices, all delivered without anesthesia, antisepsis, or accurate understanding of human physiology. Let's begin with Egyptian diagnostic methods, which relied primarily on supernatural explanations rather than empirical observation. The Edwin Smith Papyrus and Ebers Papyrus, our most complete sources on Egyptian medicine, reveal a system attributing disease primarily to evil spirits, divine punishment, or wandering womb. in women. While some conditions were recognized as having external causes, particularly obvious injuries, internal diseases were generally attributed to supernatural forces requiring magical countermeasures. This fundamentally flawed understanding led to treatments focused on spiritual intervention rather than physiological effect. Take, for example, the common Egyptian approach to infections, which involved applying animal dung, cow, donkey, or goat, directly to open wounds. Modern microbiological analysis of similar traditional dung poultices has identified dozens of pathogenic bacteria species, meaning this treatment essentially guaranteed severe infection. Archaeological evidence confirms this practice's devastating effects. Many mummified remains show massive infected wounds with evidence of dung residue still present. Egyptian surgery, while showing some anatomical knowledge, was performed without any concept of antisepsis or effective pain management. Surgical tools recovered from archaeological sites include knives, hooks, drills, and saws, all used on fully conscious patients without sterilization between procedures. The Edwin Smith Papyrus describes in clinical detail how patients should be physically restrained during operations, with multiple assistants required to hold down the screaming, struggling victim. Trepanation, drilling holes in the skull, was performed for conditions ranging from epilepsy to headaches. Analysis of trepanned skulls shows approximately a 40% survival rate based on evidence of bone healing around the surgical sites. However, survivors frequently exhibited signs of significant brain damage from the procedure itself, visible in abnormal bone growth patterns suggesting underlying neural trauma. Pain management during these procedures consisted primarily of alcoholic intoxication, sometimes supplemented with opium derivatives for the wealthy. For the majority of patients, however, pain was considered a necessary component of effective treatment. Medical texts sometimes specifically advocate for painful interventions, suggesting the patient's screaming helped expel evil spirits causing the illness. Pharmaceutical treatments represented a particularly dangerous aspect of Egyptian medicine. While some herbal remedies contained genuinely effective compounds, willow bark with its protoaspirin properties, for instance, these were outnumbered by actively harmful substances in most Egyptian prescriptions. The materia medica listed in Egyptian medical texts includes numerous toxic substances used routinely in treatments. Lead compounds were prescribed for skin conditions, gradually causing neurological damage and death through cumulative poisoning. Copper salts, used for wound treatment, created systemic toxicity with continued application. Mercury preparations, particularly popular for skin conditions and parasitic infections, caused massive organ damage in patients receiving repeated treatments. Beyond these recognizable toxins, Egyptian physicians routinely prescribed unidentifiable substances with names like fluid from a pig's ear or milk from a woman who has borne a male child. Biological materials likely teeming with pathogens when applied to open wounds or consumed as directed. The administration routes for these dubious medications often maximize their harmful effects. Fumigation, having patients inhale smoke from burning substances, was common for respiratory complaints, introducing toxic compounds directly into already compromised lungs. Eye washes for various ocular conditions frequently contained ingredients like bat blood or crushed insect parts, introducing infections to one of the body's most vulnerable tissues. Let's examine specific treatment protocols for common conditions to understand the full horror of Egyptian medicine in practice. For headaches, standard treatment involved binding herbs mixed with clay to the head, seemingly benign, except these herbal mixtures frequently included toxic plants like henbane and mandrake, absorbed through the scalp. Severe headaches might warrant more dramatic intervention, applying a live fish to the affected area, followed by incantations. Archaeological evidence suggests some headache sufferers had small portions of their scalps surgically removed as treatment, with evidence of bone infections following these procedures. Gastrointestinal complaints, perhaps the most common ailments in a population racked with parasites and foodborne illness, received particularly counterproductive treatments. Standard protocols involved inducing severe vomiting and diarrhea through administration of powerful emetics and laxatives, further dehydrating patients already compromised by dysentery or other intestinal conditions. The Eber's papyrus recommends cleansing the digestive system with mixtures containing castor oil, an effective but harsh laxative, combined with abrasive mineral components that physically damaged intestinal linings. Respiratory infections, another endemic problem in smoke-filled dwellings, were treated through a combination of inhaled irritants and oral consumption of mucus-producing substances. Patients with pneumonia or bronchitis would be instructed to inhale the smoke of burning herbs and minerals, introducing additional irritants to already inflamed lung tissue. Archaeological evidence shows distinctive lung damage in mummified remains consistent with these harmful inhalation therapies. Gynecological treatments deserve special mention for their particular brutality. The Kahun Papyrus details treatments for wandering womb, the supposed movement of the uterus within the body, blamed for conditions ranging from depression to seizures. Standard treatment involved fumigating the vagina with smoke from burning materials placed beneath a woman seated on a perforated chair, or inserting pessaries containing irritant substances meant to drive the womb back to its proper place. These treatments caused chemical burns to sensitive tissues while doing nothing to address underlying conditions. Pregnancy and childbirth interventions were equally misguided. Pregnant women were prescribed lead-containing compounds to strengthen the womb, causing developmental damage to fetuses. During difficult labor, Egyptian physicians applied weights to the abdomen or administered abortifacient herbs that stimulated violent uterine contractions, often resulting in uterine rupture and death of both mother and child. Even relatively straightforward conditions received harmfully elaborate treatments. Simple wounds would be packed with honey, an actually effective antimicrobial, mixed with copper compounds and animal dung, negating the honey's benefits by introducing massive bacterial contamination. Broken bones, while sometimes competently set and splinted, would be packed with poultices containing materials that caused irritation and delayed healing. The intertwining of magical and medical practice further compromised treatment effectiveness. Even rational therapies were typically accompanied by incantations and rituals that often took precedence over the physical intervention. Medical papyri frequently specify that medications must be prepared while reciting specific spells, administered only at certain astrological alignments, or applied a magically significant number of times, typically 7. The social dimension of Egyptian medicine created additional problems. Medical treatment was primarily available to the elite, with common people relying on folk practitioners with even less standardized knowledge. Evidence suggests most Egyptians received medical care only for immediately life-threatening conditions, suffering through chronic ailments with minimal intervention, perhaps inadvertently sparing them from the worst iatrogenic, physician-caused harms. To put Egyptian medical care in perspective, modern patients might worry about rare surgical errors or medication side effects that occur in fractions of percentage points. Ancient Egyptians seeking medical treatment faced interventions where iatrogenic harm was not the exception, but the expected outcome. The major medical papyri describe successful treatment outcomes with phrases like, "sometimes he recovers," an acknowledgement that survival occurred despite rather than because of medical intervention. The traumatic nature of Egyptian medical care created its own consequences. Many patients delayed seeking treatment until conditions became unbearable, correctly understanding that medical intervention carried significant risks. Archaeological evidence shows numerous individuals who lived with chronically dislocated joints, improperly healed fractures, and other treatable conditions, suggesting they chose to avoid available medical care, a rational decision given the dangers treatment posed. The fundamental tragedy of Egyptian medicine lies in its combination of occasional genuine insights with disastrously incorrect foundational assumptions. The same medical tradition that correctly identified the pulse as diagnostically significant also attributed epilepsy to demons requiring exorcism. The same physicians who competently reduced dislocated shoulders also prescribed crocodile dung for contraception. This inconsistent effectiveness made every medical encounter a dangerous gamble with unpredictable outcomes. In many ways, Egyptian medicine serves as the perfect microcosm for the civilization itself. Occasional brilliant innovations embedded within systems so fundamentally flawed that they often created more suffering than they alleviated. For the average Egyptian, seeking medical treatment represented not a path to healing, but a desperate gamble when all other options had been exhausted. The final roll of the dice when death seemed otherwise certain. When nature turned against you, environmental threats. If the combination of brutal labor, parasitic infections, dangerous animals, and harmful medical treatments somehow failed to destroy you, the Egyptian environment itself stood ready to deliver the coup de grace through a range of natural phenomena that transformed survival into a perpetual gamble against forces beyond human control. The Nile River, often romantically portrayed as Egypt's benevolent life-giver, manifested a dual nature that Egyptian religious texts acknowledged through the constant tension between order, ma'at, and chaos, isfet. While the annual inundation provided essential irrigation and soil nutrients, its unpredictability created existential anxiety at both population and individual levels. Consider the mathematical reality of Nile flooding. Archaeological and geological evidence shows that significant deviations from optimal flood levels occurred approximately every 5 to 7 years, with catastrophic variations, either excessive flooding or insufficient inundation, occurring once every 20 years on average. Within a typical Egyptian's limited lifespan, they would experience 3 to 4 significant food shortages and at least one famine severe enough to cause widespread death. Insufficient flooding created the most obvious threats: failed crops, limited drinking water, and the socioeconomic cascade effects of food shortages. Skeletal remains from periods of known low inundation show distinctive stress markers, horizontal lines in teeth and bones that form during periods of severe malnutrition. These markers appear with such regularity in Egyptian remains that archaeologists can track historical flood failures through their prevalence in buried populations. During severe drought periods, the consequences extended beyond mere hunger. Water quality deteriorated as reduced flow concentrated contaminants. Desperation drove people to consume unsafe food sources, including grain contaminated with mycotoxins from improper storage and animals that would normally be rejected as diseased or unfit. Archaeological evidence from drought periods shows increased prevalence of diseases transmitted through concentrated human waste in water sources, particularly cholera and dysentery. Excessive flooding, counterintuitively, often proved even more devastating. When the Nile rose significantly above optimal levels, it destroyed rather than nourished. Mud brick homes and structures dissolved literally overnight, leaving entire communities homeless. Drowning became a leading cause of death during these periods, particularly among children. Archaeological evidence from flood periods shows distinctive trauma patterns, consistent with drowning and flood-related injuries, primarily fractures from being swept against hard objects by floodwaters. The aftermath of major floods created secondary crises. Standing water provided ideal breeding grounds for mosquitoes and waterborne parasites, leading to disease outbreaks. Food storage facilities, typically at ground level, were destroyed along with their contents, creating immediate shortages even if subsequent planting remained possible. The psychological impact of watching homes, possessions, and livelihoods literally dissolve proved particularly devastating, with evidence of increased religious offerings and desperate magical practices during these periods. Beyond the Nile's fluctuations, Egypt's climate itself presented constant threats to human survival. The summer heat in Upper Egypt regularly exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit, 49 degrees Celsius, with ground temperatures in direct sun reaching levels capable of causing second-degree burns through brief contact. Without modern cooling technology, heat stroke and hyperthermia claimed countless lives annually, particularly among the elderly and young children. Medical papyri describe treatments for fire in the body, likely heat stroke, suggesting its common occurrence. Desert environments surrounding the narrow Nile Valley created additional hardships. Sandstorms, camps and winds, occurred regularly during spring months, with wind speeds exceeding 80 miles per hour and sand concentrations high enough to cause respiratory failure. These weren't rare meteorological events, but predictable seasonal occurrences that Egyptians endured repeatedly throughout their lives. The extreme temperature fluctuations of desert environments added another layer of physical stress. While daytime temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, nighttime temperatures in the same locations could drop below freezing during winter months. Without effective insulation or heating technology, hypothermia claimed lives during colder months, particularly among those already weakened by malnutrition or illness. The constant metabolic stress of adapting to these temperature swings contributed to abbreviated lifespans, even when not directly fatal. Even the soil that provided Egypt's agricultural bounty harbored hidden dangers. The Nile's annual deposit of silt contained naturally occurring heavy metals, including arsenic, lead, and mercury, which gradually accumulated in human tissues through consumption of crops grown in contaminated soil. Modern analysis of mummified remains shows elevated heavy metal concentrations in many individuals, particularly those from regions with known geological sources of these contaminants. The resulting chronic low-level poisoning contributed to neurological damage, reduced fertility, and compromised immune function. Rainfall, rare but significant when it occurred, created its own hazards. The limestone formations surrounding many Egyptian settlements became dangerously unstable when saturated, leading to catastrophic rock slides during infrequent but intense rain events. Archaeological evidence documents entire communities buried by such slides, with human remains showing characteristic crush injuries. The rarity of these events made them particularly terrifying, striking without the predictability that allowed adaptation to more regular threats. Perhaps most devastating were the locust swarms that periodically descended on Egyptian agricultural areas. These weren't the small-scale insect nuisances familiar to modern gardeners, but biblical-scale hordes covering thousands of square miles. A typical swarm contained billions of individuals capable of consuming 100,000 tons of vegetation daily, equivalent to the food supply for 500,000 people. Egyptian agricultural records document years when the locusts ate everything. Not poetic exaggeration, but literal description of complete crop destruction across entire regions. The unpredictability of these swarms made them particularly devastating psychologically. They might appear once in a generation or several times within a decade, with no warning and no effective countermeasures. Temple records document mass offerings and desperate religious ceremonies conducted as locusts descended, reflecting the absolute helplessness Egyptians felt watching their food supply being devoured before their eyes. Famine, resulting from these environmental catastrophes, created secondary horrors beyond mere hunger. Archaeological and textual evidence documents the breakdown of social norms during extreme food shortages. Desperate parents abandoned children they couldn't feed. Infanticide increased, particularly of female infants, requiring dowries for eventual marriage. In extreme cases, Egyptian records obliquely reference cannibalism emerging in isolated communities cut off from external food sources. The skeletal evidence tells the biological story of these periods. Human remains from known famine periods show not just malnutrition markers, but distinctive patterns of violence. Skull fractures, defensive wounds on arms, and cut marks on bones consistent with flesh removal. The environmental threat thus cascaded into social collapse, with humans becoming threats to each other when resources fell below survival thresholds. Waterborne natural disasters, while less common in Egypt than some regions, occurred with sufficient frequency to maintain collective trauma. Flash floods in desert wadis, normally dry riverbeds, could manifest with minimal warning during rare rainfall events, sweeping away anyone caught in their path. The force of these sudden floods could move boulders weighing several tons, making human survival virtually impossible for anyone in their direct path. Earthquakes, though relatively infrequent in Egypt compared to more tectonically active regions, occurred often enough to maintain cultural memory of their devastation. The primary threat came not from the earth movement itself, but from the collapse of mud brick structures, which crumbled catastrophically during even moderate seismic activity. Archaeological evidence documents multiple settlement layers showing earthquake destruction, with human remains exhibiting characteristic crush injuries from falling structures. Air quality represented another environmental threat, entirely invisible to Egyptian understanding, but devastating in its effects. The combination of desert dust, smoke from cooking fires, pollen, and agricultural burning created air pollution levels that would exceed modern safety standards by orders of magnitude. Without the concept of air quality or its health impacts, Egyptians simply endured chronic respiratory inflammation as a normal condition of existence, unaware of its contribution to reduced lifespans and susceptibility to pulmonary infections. The psychological dimension of these environmental threats cannot be overstated. Modern humans typically experience natural disasters as rare, newsworthy events. Ancient Egyptians lived with the certainty that nature would regularly attempt to kill them through mechanisms beyond their control or understanding. This created a fundamentally different relationship with the natural world, a constant vigilance and anxiety about environmental conditions that modern people experience only during extreme weather events. To put this in perspective, today we check weather apps to decide between wearing a jacket or carrying an umbrella. Egyptians observed subtle environmental cues to determine whether their children would eat next season or starve. Modern humans might evacuate for a hurricane with days of warning. Egyptians had minutes or seconds to escape flash floods and no warning at all for earthquakes or rock slides. Egyptian religious practices reflected this environmental reality through elaborate systems focused on controlling natural forces through divine intercession. The predictive calendars, astronomical observations, and mathematical calculations developed by Egyptian priests weren't abstract intellectual exercises, but desperate attempts to anticipate and mitigate environmental threats through preparation and ritual intervention. When modern observers note the superstitious nature of Egyptian religion, they fundamentally misunderstand its origin and rational response to an unpredictable and frequently lethal environment. Perhaps most telling is how environmental threats shaped Egyptian conceptions of the afterlife. The otherworld described in funerary texts represents not just theological abstraction, but the inverse of Egyptian environmental reality, a place of perfect agricultural abundance without drought or flood, comfortable temperatures without extremes, and absolute predictability without natural disasters. The paradise Egyptians imagined wasn't filled with conceptual pleasures, but specifically addressed the environmental horrors they endured throughout their earthly existence. Social horror, hierarchy, slavery, and oppression. Beyond the physical torments of disease, labor, and environmental threat, ancient Egyptian society itself constituted a sophisticated system of oppression that transformed human suffering into sustainable social structure. The romanticized view of Egyptian civilization obscures a fundamental reality. It was built upon institutionalized inequality so extreme that different social classes effectively experienced entirely different worlds while occupying the same physical space. Let's begin by demystifying the famous Egyptian social pyramid. Modern descriptions often sanitize this system with neutral terms like stratification or specialization, but archaeological evidence reveals its brutal reality. Skeletal analysis tells the biological story that hieroglyphic propaganda obscures. Elite Egyptian males averaged approximately 5 inches taller than labor-class individuals, with significantly fewer stress markers, nutritional deficiencies, and work-related injuries. This wasn't minor variation, but fundamental biological divergence based on differential access to resources. The agricultural laborers who formed the majority of the population existed in a state of highly managed deprivation. Tax documents preserved on papyri reveal extraction rates that modern economists would consider unsustainable, typically 50 to 70% of all production, with higher percentages during emergency periods that archaeological evidence suggests were almost continuous. This taxation wasn't abstract or financial, but brutally physical. Scribes and soldiers literally counting and removing food from peasant storage before it could be consumed by its producers. Archaeological evidence from worker villages shows the consequences: chronic malnutrition, even during prosperous periods, with food remains indicating diets consisting primarily of coarse bread and onions, with minimal protein. The biological consequences appear in skeletal remains: delayed growth, reduced stature, vitamin deficiencies visible in bone formation, and degenerative conditions appearing decades earlier than in elite remains. Modern nationalistic Egyptian narratives often deny the existence of slavery in ancient Egypt, but archaeological and textual evidence contradicts this revisionism. While the system differed from later Roman or American models, unfree labor constituted a significant component of the Egyptian economy. War captives, legally designated as living dead, worked in conditions so brutal that skeletal remains show distinctive patterns of chronic injury, malnutrition, and premature death that archaeologists can identify as slave markers without additional context. The temple town of Kehun provides particularly clear evidence through its architectural segregation. Excavation revealed elite housing with spacious rooms, effective sewage systems, and cooking facilities alongside worker barracks with minimal space, no sanitation, and high-density occupation. The contrast wasn't incidental, but deliberately engineered social segregation that prevented lower classes from observing the actual living conditions of their superiors, maintaining the illusion that deprivation was universal rather than imposed. For those not born into formal slavery, the corvée labor system created functional enslavement for significant portions of each year. Administrative texts document systematic conscription of workers for state projects, with physical restraints used during transportation to work sites. These weren't volunteer projects with fair compensation, but forced labor backed by violent enforcement. Skeletal remains near construction sites show evidence of shackle marks on leg bones and distinctive trauma patterns consistent with overwork and punishment. Corporal punishment formed the fundamental enforcement mechanism for this system. Administrative texts matter-of-factly document beating as the standard response to work slowdowns, tax shortfalls, or other forms of non-compliance. These weren't symbolic punishments, but physically devastating assaults. Medical texts include specific sections on treating wounds from official beatings, suggesting their routine occurrence. Some mummified remains show distinctive scarring patterns on backs and buttocks, consistent with systematic whipping, visible evidence of physical enforcement that maintained social boundaries. The legal system formalized this physical coercion. Unlike the supposed equality before the law of modern judicial ideals, Egyptian law explicitly prescribed different punishments for identical crimes based on the social status of both perpetrator and victim. A peasant stealing from a noble might face execution, while a noble stealing from a peasant might receive a minor fine or no punishment whatsoever. These weren't corrupt deviations from ideal justice, but the system functioning as designed, preserving social hierarchy through differential application of violence. Even the superficially meritocratic aspects of Egyptian society, like the scribal profession that theoretically allowed social advancement through education, operated as sophisticated mechanisms of oppression. Textual evidence from scribal schools reveals education methods based primarily on physical punishment, with beatings administered for the slightest errors in copying or recitation. The famous maxim, "A boy's ears are on his back. He listens when he is beaten," wasn't metaphorical, but literal pedagogical principle, creating trauma-bonded loyalty to the system among those permitted to advance within it. For women, social oppression incorporated additional gendered dimensions beyond class stratification. Medical and administrative texts reveal a system that treated female bodies as reproductive resources rather than autonomous persons. Female genital mutilation, documented in both textual descriptions and mummified remains, was practiced across social classes, physically enforcing control of female sexuality. Gynecological treatments focused primarily on maximizing fertility while minimizing female autonomy, with wandering womb theories justifying painful and controlling interventions. Child exploitation represented perhaps the darkest aspect of Egyptian social structure. Children weren't recognized as requiring protection, but treated as economic assets from their earliest years. Archaeological evidence from craft workshops shows child-sized tools and distinctive skeletal injuries in juvenile remains, consistent with specialized child labor. Small finger bones found in mining contexts suggest children were used in narrow tunnels too small for adults, many dying from rockfalls and suffocation in these dangerous conditions. The ideological justification for this oppressive system operated through both religious frameworks and practical limitations on information flow. Hieroglyphic literacy remained restricted to approximately 1% of the population, creating an effective information monopoly for the elite. Religious texts explicitly described social stratification as divinely ordained, with the pharaoh as living god and social hierarchy as cosmic principle rather than human arrangement. Challenging these structures constituted not just political dissent, but blasphemous disorder, justifying the harshest suppression. To put Egyptian social oppression in perspective, modern criticism of wealth inequality focuses on differential access to luxury goods and opportunities. Ancient Egyptian inequality determined who would eat and who would starve during shortages, who received medical care versus who suffered without treatment, and whose children might survive versus whose would likely die. These weren't abstract disparities, but life or death allocations based entirely on accident of birth. The archaeological evidence tells this story more eloquently than any text. Elite cemeteries contain remains of individuals who lived into their 50s and 60s with minimal evidence of physical labor, treated injuries, and adequate nutrition. Commoner cemeteries from the same periods hold individuals rarely surviving past 30, with untreated fractures, chronic malnutrition markers, and bodies literally worn out from ceaseless labor. This wasn't minor variation in privilege, but entirely different human experiences determined by social position. Most disturbing is how this system maintains stability through careful calibration of suffering rather than improvement of conditions. Administrative texts discuss the precise levels of resource extraction possible without triggering revolt or social collapse, preserving the minimum sustenance necessary for continued labor while maximizing appropriation by elites. The physical nightmare of daily labor. Around you in the darkness, your family stirs on their own reed mats. Your household consists of 8 people, crowded into a space roughly the size of a modern bathroom. There's your father, considered elderly at 35, his body broken by decades of hauling limestone blocks for building projects. His teeth have been ground to painful nubs by the stone particles in every bite of bread he's consumed throughout his life. Your mother, barely 30, has already borne 7 children, of whom only 3 survived past infancy. Her once straight back is permanently bent from years of grinding grain and carrying water. This is what awaits you. Not old age as we understand it, but a slow physical disintegration that begins in what we would consider youth. As the first hint of dawn appears, you're already preparing for work. There's no concept of breakfast as a leisurely meal to start your day. You might grab a piece of day-old bread, already growing mold in the humid air, and chew it as you walk toward the fields. Food is fuel, nothing more, and you need just enough to power your body through what comes next. For most Egyptians, dawn marks the beginning of agricultural labor, so physically demanding, it would break a modern CrossFit champion within hours. Imagine workdays lasting from first light until dusk, 12 to 14 hours of continuous physical exertion without breaks, ergonomic equipment, proper hydration, or any pain management. Nothing about this work is designed for human comfort or safety. It's simply what must be done to avoid starvation. The primary farming tool awaiting you is the shadoof, a counterweighted lever used to lift water from the Nile into irrigation channels. Operating this device means hours of repetitive motion, lifting the equivalent of a 50-pound weight thousands of times per day. Archaeological evidence shows that most farmers developed asymmetrical skeletal structures, with the shoulder and arm used for shadoof operation becoming grotesquely overdeveloped, while the spine twisted into permanent deformity. Let's put this in perspective. Modern gyms consider lifting weights for 1 hour to be a complete workout. Your Egyptian counterpart performed the equivalent of lifting weights continuously for 12 hours, without rest periods, proper form, or recovery days, in temperatures regularly exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And this wasn't an occasional activity. This was every single day from childhood until physical collapse or death. When not operating waterlifting devices, you'd be bent double in fields, planting or harvesting with primitive tools that tore at your hands and strained your back. Farmers' skeletons from this period show vertebrae actually fused together from decades of bending at the same angle, locking the spine into a permanent stoop. By age 30, most agricultural workers were physically incapable of standing fully upright, their bodies permanently deformed by repetitive stress. But perhaps you're not a farmer. Maybe you've been assigned to the quarries or construction projects, an even more devastating fate. Let's demystify pyramid building, shall we? Forget alien assistance or mysterious lost technologies. The reality was simple and horrifying. Human bodies used as expendable machines. Quarry workers used copper chisels to cut massive blocks from limestone formations, tools barely harder than the stone itself, requiring enormous physical force for minimal progress. Imagine spending 12 hours a day hammering a metal spike into concrete with a rock, breathing in a constant cloud of fine stone dust, your lungs gradually accumulating silicosis with each breath. Archaeological evidence shows quarry workers' remains have distinctive wear patterns on arm bones and chest deformities from constant hammering motions, along with catastrophic lung damage visible in preserved tissue. The transport of stone blocks represents another level of physical horror entirely. Teams of 20 to 40 men would be harnessed to sleds carrying blocks, weighing multiple tons, dragging them across the desert using nothing but raw, human muscle power. Modern experiments attempting to replicate these methods have required well-fed, hydrated volunteers working in shifts with modern safety precautions. Your Egyptian counterparts did this continuously, with minimal water, insufficient nutrition, and no safety measures whatsoever. The archaeological record tells the brutal truth that tour guides and romanticized documentaries omit. Mass graves near construction sites contain skeletons showing patterns consistent with crushing injuries. Spinal compression fractures appear in nearly every recovered worker's remains. Shoulders and hips display advanced degradation typically associated with modern-day elderly populations, except these injuries appear in Egyptians as young as 25. To put this in perspective, OSHA, the modern workplace safety organization, would estimate that building the Great Pyramid today, even with modern safety protocols, would result in approximately 150 workplace deaths. Egyptologists estimate the actual death toll during original construction exceeded 10,000 workers, or roughly one death for every 250 blocks placed. Each time you admire the precise alignment of pyramid blocks, you're looking at a structure that cost a human life for approximately every 20 feet of completed construction. If you were among the skilled laborers, your fate might seem marginally better, but brought its own specialized forms of physical destruction. Metal workers develop tremors and neurological damage from constant exposure to toxic fumes. Leather workers spent their days handling urine and feces used in the tanning process, their hands eternally raw from caustic substances. Even scribes, considered the elite of workers, develop distinctive spinal deformities from decades hunched over writing surfaces, their skeletal remains immediately identifiable by the specific pattern of vertebral fusion. What makes this physical devastation particularly horrific isn't just its intensity, but its inescapability. Modern workers suffering injuries can seek treatment, change careers, or access disability support. Your Egyptian counterpart simply endured until the body failed completely. The concept of workplace accident didn't exist. Catastrophic injuries were simply expected components of daily labor. Archaeological evidence tells stories more tragic than any historical text could capture. The Broken Man of Giza, a skeleton discovered near the Great Pyramid, shows an individual who survived a crushing injury that shattered his pelvis, followed by years of continued labor, evidenced by new wear patterns adapted to his deformed structure. He didn't receive rest and rehabilitation, he simply found new ways to haul stones with a broken body until eventual death. Perhaps the most telling perspective comes from comparing Egyptian workers' remains with those of contemporaneous hunter-gatherer populations. Despite the supposed advancement of Egyptian civilization, hunter-gatherers typically displayed healthier skeletons, fewer stress injuries, and longer lifespans than their Egyptian counterparts. The very civilization, considered one of history's greatest achievements, was, for most of its inhabitants, a physical meat grinder that consumed human bodies at an unprecedented rate. Continuing, the brutal reality of ancient Egypt. The psychological nightmare, minds crushed by horror. Having explored the physical devastation of Egyptian existence through labor, disease, predation, and social oppression, we must now confront perhaps the most overlooked aspect of ancient suffering, the psychological state of individuals trapped in this merciless reality. The ancient Egyptian mind existed in a state of perpetual trauma that modern psychology lacks adequate terminology to fully describe. Imagine developing consciousness in a world where your earliest memories include siblings dying in agony, parasites visibly emerging from your skin, and the constant background noise of adults crying out in physical pain during nightly hours. This wasn't exceptional trauma. It was the baseline human experience from which your understanding of existence formed. The psychological impact of witnessing death as a daily occurrence cannot be overstated. Conservative estimates suggest the average Egyptian witnessed 25 to 30 deaths of immediate family and close community members before reaching adulthood. These weren't peaceful passings, but often protracted, agonizing ends. Siblings convulsing from waterborne illnesses, parents gradually succumbing to infected wounds, infants slowly starving during food shortages. By age 15, the typical Egyptian had spent approximately 200 hours directly observing the dying process in loved ones. Archaeological evidence tells this story through burial practices. Mass graves containing multiple children from the same families suggest periods where emotional capacity to properly process grief simply collapsed under the weight of continuing losses. Grave goods show signs of desperate psychological attempts to maintain connection with the deceased, evidenced by everyday objects broken and reassembled before burial, suggesting the traumatic disruption of attachment and attempts to symbolically repair what was irrevocably lost. The psychological burden of constant physical pain merits its own discussion. Without effective pain management, chronic suffering from dental abscesses, parasitic infections, and work injuries created a population experiencing what modern pain specialists would classify as debilitating levels of physical distress during most waking hours. The psychological consequences included sleep disruption, cognitive impairment, and emotional dysregulation that modern patients experience during short-term pain episodes. Except for Egyptians, this state was permanent. How did the psyche adapt to such conditions? Evidence suggests the development of psychological defense mechanisms so profound they altered cultural expression at every level. Religious texts demonstrate extensive preoccupation with dissociation, the separation of conscious awareness from bodily experience. Funerary texts describing the K, spiritual double, and Ba, soul, potentially reflect psychological adaptations that allowed individuals to mentally separate from their suffering physical forms. The emotional numbing necessary to function in this environment created interpersonal dynamics barely recognizable to modern understanding. Attachment patterns between parents and children show evidence of what psychologists now call defensive detachment, the deliberate emotional distancing from individuals likely to suffer and die. Parents typically delayed naming children until survival seemed probable and invested emotional resources gradually as viability increased, not from lack of love, but as a necessary psychological shield against unrelenting grief. Egyptian art's iconic stylistic conventions, particularly the emotionless facial expressions and rigid postures, may reflect more than aesthetic preference. They potentially demonstrate a culture-wide adaptive response to trauma through emotional constriction. The absence of expressiveness in artistic representation parallels the psychological flattening observed in modern trauma survivors for whom emotional numbing becomes necessary for functional survival. The cognitive burden of navigating constant threats created what modern psychologists would identify as hypervigilance, the exhausting state of perpetual alertness to danger. Imagine the cognitive load of Egyptian existence, checking water for predators before drinking, examining food for visible parasites, testing each footstep during nighttime movement to avoid venomous creatures, continuously monitoring physical symptoms for signs of developing infections. This constant threat assessment consumed cognitive resources that might otherwise support more complex thought, emotional processing, or abstract problem solving. Even sleep provided no psychological respite. Without understanding of sleep architecture or its importance for mental health, Egyptians typically slept in short, interrupted segments, constantly disrupted by physical pain, environmental threats, and the sounds of others suffering nearby. Sleep deprivation consequences, irritability, impaired judgment, emotional dysregulation, and perceptual distortions weren't occasional experiences but permanent cognitive conditions for most of the population. The psychological impact of social oppression added another dimension of suffering. For common Egyptians, the awareness that their physical suffering directly enabled elite luxury created what modern psychologists would identify as moral injury, the trauma resulting from witnessing or participating in events that violate core ethical beliefs. Tax collection records show increasingly desperate attempts to hide resources as seasonal shortages threatened survival, only to be discovered and punished, creating cycles of hopelessness and learned helplessness. Religious texts reveal the psychological consequences of this power differential through the development of complex moral accounting systems. The elaborate afterlife judgment scenes in funerary texts, with hearts weighed against the feather of truth, potentially represent psychological attempts to resolve the profound cognitive dissonance between observed reality, where the powerful prospered through others' suffering, and the need to believe in fundamental cosmic fairness. The psychological concept of just world hypothesis manifested in elaborate afterlife punishments for elites who abused power. Evidence of what modern psychology would classify as dissociative disorders appears throughout Egyptian medical and religious texts. Descriptions of individuals experiencing invasion by foreign spirits, Personality fragmentation and detachment from physical sensation or emotion correspond precisely to the symptoms of dissociative conditions documented in modern trauma survivors. These weren't supernatural experiences, but predictable psychological responses to overwhelming trauma. Perhaps most psychologically devastating was the complete absence of conceptual frameworks for potential improvement. Unlike modern individuals who suffer with at least theoretical awareness that pain can end or conditions might improve, ancient Egyptians had no historical evidence or cultural narrative suggesting life could be fundamentally different. The psychological concept of possible selves, imagined future versions of oneself, contained no versions with reduced suffering, creating a cognitive framework where suffering wasn't a temporary state, but the permanent, immutable condition of existence. The ultimate psychological adaptation to this reality appears in the extraordinary emphasis on afterlife preparation across all social classes, not just elites. Archaeological evidence shows even the poorest Egyptians devoted significant limited resources to securing minimal funeral rites. This wasn't mere supernatural belief, but a profound psychological response to unrelenting trauma, the creation of a conceptual space where suffering might finally end. The elaborate afterlife landscape described in funerary texts directly addresses each form of earthly suffering with its specific negation: abundant food, physical integrity, freedom from labor, and absence of pain. To put this psychological burden in perspective, modern trauma treatment considers witnessing a single death as potentially causing post-traumatic stress, requiring therapeutic intervention. Ancient Egyptians experienced the equivalent of multiple modern diagnostic criteria for complex PTSD as their baseline psychological state from earliest childhood, without any conceptual framework for processing this reality as abnormal or any therapeutic interventions to mitigate its effects. The most poignant evidence of this psychological reality comes not from grand tombs or religious texts, but from the smallest archaeological findings: tiny handmade amulets clutched in the hands of deceased children, revealing the desperate attempts of parents to provide psychological comfort to the suffering young. Humble offerings in small shrines, showing evidence of repeated handling as individuals sought any connection to potential sources of relief, and the careful positioning of the dead with implements of their earthly suffering deliberately broken, releasing them symbolically from the physical burdens that had defined their existence. This wasn't mere superstition, but sophisticated psychological adaptation to conditions so unbearable that only through elaborate cognitive frameworks dividing existence into temporal suffering and eternal peace could the human mind continue functioning under such relentless assault. The Egyptian preoccupation with death represented not morbid fascination, but the psychological necessity of creating meaning within a reality that otherwise offered only senseless suffering, with no possibility of relief.